Welcome to the Worldshapers, conversations with authors about their latest books. I'm your host, Edward Willett, and this episode's guest, Brian Nelson, talking about The Great Unmaking, Book 3 in his Course of Empire trilogy. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Worldshapers, the podcast where I talk to other authors about their latest books. My name is Edward Willett. I am myself an author of many books, of both science fiction and fantasy and nonfiction for readers of all ages. And I am also a publisher. My publishing company is Shadowpaw Press. On the writing side, my latest novel was The Tangled Stars, which came out from Daw Books back in late 2022. It's an outer space adventure, humorous outer space adventure, featuring an AI-uplifted talking cat who becomes a starship captain. On the publishing side, Shadowpaw Press has been rather ridiculously active this year and will continue to be so. I've already published 5 books this year, and let me tell you about them now. This is the most recent. One of the most recent, and also, of course, one of the most exciting, because it's by Hugo and Nebula award-winning author Robert J. Sawyer, who was a guest on the podcast back in January, if you want to check that out. It's The Downloaded. It's his 25th novel, and it started life as an Audible original audiobook with Brendan Fraser in the cast. I won't try to describe it. It's got a lot of ideas in it about uploaded consciousness and where the future might take us. So, yeah, check out The Downloaded by Robert J. Sawyer. Coming out at the same time was this book by another great Canadian science fiction fantasy author, Dave Duncan. Dave died in 2018. This is the book he was awaiting edits on when he died. It's a science fiction adventure as well, set on a colony world where everything is slowly falling apart, and only the son of an infamous traitor may be able to save things, hence the name, The Traitor's Son. And I'll have another Dave Duncan book coming out from Shadowpaw Press this summer called Corridor to Nightmare. That one's a fantasy. Also out this year, we've had Nir Yaniv's The Good Soldier. This is science fiction, military science fiction satire, I guess you would call it. Catch-22 in outer space, or MASH meets Starship Troopers, something like that. Set on a spaceship with a mobilized infantry, sort of like Starship Troopers. But that's about where the similarity ends, because things go differently in this book. It's a very funny book, and it's based on a classic anti-military satire from the early 20th century, also called The Good Soldier. So this one's by Nir Yaniv, and that's what it looks like. You should check it out, too. And also, we had this one by another author who's been on the podcast earlier in the year, Mark Morton. This is a young adult dystopian science fiction set in northern Ontario at a research facility where things went horribly wrong at one point, and these alien parasites came through and attached themselves to everybody who's there. The rest of the world has fallen silent, so whatever happened badly everywhere. And it's about a young girl as she gets older and figures out that she might have a way to fight these things. So that's The Headmasters by Mark Morton. And then the last one I want to mention is directly tied to this podcast. This one came out in January as well. It's Shapers of Worlds Volume 4, and this features science fiction and fantasy by authors who were guests of the podcast during its 5th year. Up until episode 150, I only interviewed science fiction and fantasy authors. I now have broadened that a bit, and I've interviewed some other people and will in the future. But this one was from the 4th year. Sorry, I think I said 5th year. I just kickstarted Volume 5, which will be out this fall, and going into 2025 is when the commercial release will be. It'll be to backers this fall. So Shapers of Worlds Volume 4, wonderful authors in there like Sherilyn Kenyon and David Boop and Michael Brent Collings and Sarah A. Hoyt and Lavi Tidhar and James Van Pelt, Jean-Louis Trudel. Too many to name entirely, but look that one up. That's what I'm doing when I'm not doing this, but today I'm doing this. This episode of The Worldshapers features Brian Nelson. So put on my reading glasses, and we will introduce you to Brian Nelson, and then we'll talk to him. Brian was born and raised in Ohio and is a graduate of Miami University. After a brief stint as a systems engineer for General Motors, he set off for the University of Arizona to study creative writing. After graduation, he spent 2 years in Venezuela as a Fulbright scholar and turned his research into the critically acclaimed book The Silence and the Scorpion, a clocked account of the 2002 uprising against Hugo Chavez. The book was named one of the best books of the year by The Economist and was considered by the New York Times as the most thorough investigation of the April 11th massacre and the subsequent coup. His second book, The Last Swordmaker, starts the trilogy, whose third book we'll be talking about today, is an action-packed thriller about a high-tech arms race between the United States and China. It follows a diverse cast of characters as they strive to be the first to make the next generation of weapons using a mixture of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and nanotechnology. The sequel, Five Tribes, was long-listed for Best Novel of 2021 by Reading the West. The book is a globe-trotting adventure that not only examines the changing face of warfare, but asks what it means to be human in our ever-changing technological world. And the final book in the trilogy, The Great Unmaking, which we talk about in a bit more detail, came out last year in March 2023. Brian's other work has appeared in the Virginia Quarterly Review, the Christian Science Monitor, and the Southern Humanities Review, among others, and he lives in Denver with his wife and 2 children. So that's Brian Nelson, and let's talk to him now. So, Brian, welcome to the Worldshapers.
Thank you, Ed. It's great to be here. I'm excited.
Now, I look for connections. I don't think we have any. Haven't met, haven't, other than I'm doing a podcast and you're an author and I'm an author too. I guess that's a connection, but anyway. So I'm
Well,
glad to
you're
have
in
you on.
Canada. You're in Canada, so I have to
Yes.
ask you if you're a Rush fan, if you like the rock band Rush.
No, I can't say that I am. Sorry. I'm a
Okay.
Saskatchewan Roughriders fan, but that's not the same thing at all. So,
Okay. Okay.
let's start at the very beginning. I always say that, and then I immediately think of The Sound of Music. A very good place to start. Tell me about yourself. Where were you born and grew up, and how did the writing bug get hold of you?
Yeah, I grew up in Ohio, between Dayton and Cincinnati. There's a small college town there. That's where Miami University is. And my father was on the faculty there, and both my parents actually had studied international relations. So I had a kind of a natural interest or desire to understand other cultures. So I did a lot of traveling. I did like a year abroad in high school in Venezuela. I did a semester abroad in Australia, and I got to work internationally. So one of my first jobs out of college was in IT, which that actually was a big influence on me wanting to write these books, which focused so much on technology. So I worked actually for General Motors in Detroit as a systems engineer. And then it was kind of when I'd felt I'd kind of been successful in that, where I was like, well, why don't I try to do that thing that I thought was unrealistic? When I was picking my major in college, you can't possibly be a writer. That's not realistic. So I decided to throw in the towel on the corporate life, and I went back to grad school. I was 29, and coming out of an MFA program in Arizona, I got a Fulbright grant to go to Venezuela to write a book. So my first project, which is behind me that way, is a book called The Silence and the Scorpion, which is sort of clocks this uprising against Hugo Chavez that happened in 2002. So it's kind of one of these clocked narratives where you're just going from point of view to point of view during this 72-hour crisis that sort of caused all this upheaval in Venezuela. So that was my first book. And
That's a
then
challenging first book.
it was. It took about 6 years to get it all done, but it did really well. It was put on. It was named one of the best books of the year by The Economist, and then that was nonfiction, which is a little bit weird because my MFA or my studies had been fiction, but I was able to use a lot of those techniques in that book to sort of make it come alive and be a quick read, even though it was history. And then I went back to a project I'd started in graduate school, which is this looking at technology and science and how the military might use or merge different technologies like AI, genetic engineering, nanotechnology, and how these might be weaponized. And that's sort of the basis for this trilogy, which is called The Course of Empire.
So going back to when you were growing up, did you start writing back then? Were you like writing short stories when you were a kid and showing them to people, or how early did you really
Yeah,
get into that?
I don't know if other writers have this kind of moment, but there was, I think it was seventh grade. I wrote a short story for my teacher, my seventh grade English teacher, and she was like, "Wow, this is really good," and that was kind of enough to make me think, "Hey, maybe this is something I can do well." And that definitely inspired me. And through high school, definitely felt I was pretty good at it. But like I mentioned, it wasn't one of those things you felt like, okay, I'm
No.
so good at this that I have to do it, or it's practical. So definitely put it aside during college, although I did take a few writing classes, a few workshops. And one of the things I thought was interesting, and I'd like to hear your experience too, when I graduated from college and I looked back on everything I'd done, the thing that I was most proud of was the short stories I'd written for my English classes. I was like, that felt the most sort of, I don't know, satisfying to me. And I don't
Yeah,
know if you
I
feel something similar to that.
well, there are some similarities there. I wrote my first complete short story when I was 11 years old in grade seven because I'd skipped a grade, so I was in grade seven, and yeah, and I showed it to my teacher, and it was just something to do for a rainy day. Is when I wrote it with a friend. He never finished his. Mine was called Glass Hypership Test Pilot, which shows where my brain was
That
very
is a
early
great
on.
title. That is a great title.
Because I knew that science fiction characters had to have weird names, so I picked that one out of the air. And and instead of just patting me on the head, he said, "Oh yeah, well, this is good, but I don't understand why the characters acted like this, and why did this." And I thought, "Oh, he's got a point. Maybe I can do better next time." And so I actually dedicated a recent novel to him. I managed to track him down and send him a copy. He's living overseas now, but yeah, so there I did have that, and then I also thought, well, you can't. I wanted to write, but I knew you can't make a living as a writer. What I did was go into journalism, where I was at least using words.
Yes.
But in college, I placed. Did I win or placed in the top three anyway? In the creative writing contest one year, and that's actually the thing. And a literary magazine that we threw together, some friends and I threw together. Those are actually the things I remember the best. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
much the same experience. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something about that creativity, the hard work you have to put in it, the revision. It's deeply satisfying, and I think when you talk about Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey and stuff, I think there's something primitive and satisfying not only about hearing stories, but about creating your own stories too.
So when you
Yeah.
did start to create your novels, did you ever do any shorter fiction in there, or sell any short stories or anything, or was it straight into novels?
Yeah, I definitely did quite a few short stories. I did some memoir. So I think the first thing I ever got published that wasn't like an op-ed or something journalistic was a piece of nonfiction about a friend of mine who'd been in an accident and was confined to a wheelchair. And but what I find is things just get big for me really fast. Whenever I start to write something, it just starts to grow and expand, and I have a lot of trouble keeping things short. Um, I read a biography of Tolkien a couple of years ago, and reading his sort of early drafts of poems and things, I was like, oh, I wonder if I can make like an epic, poem, in the Tolkien style. So I tried it out, and it took me 5 months and was 35 pages long. And it was supposed to be one poem. So it just sort of shows my inability to sort of do things on a small scale. I just keep adding layers and layers to them.
So what was the novel that your first novel that was published?
So the first one in the series is the first novel. It's
Yeah.
called The Last Swordmaker.
I love that
And
title, by the way.
yeah, thanks. Some people sort of scratch their heads about it, but it's basically about high-tech weapons research, and it's about an arms race between the United States and China as they try to, outwit each other and become the first to reach this sort of milestone where you essentially make programmable microscopic machines, which you can use in various applications. Manufacturing, like you can make new types of weapons that are better airplanes, better submarines. But there's also the application of using them as swarms, using them to enter people's bodies. Of course, you can kill people with them, but then you can also technically manipulate people as well. So at the beginning of the second book, for example, there's the U.S. government is trying to break someone out of a prison in Africa, and so they use the nanotechnology to basically incite a riot by entering the bodies of the other prisoners and hyping up their cortisol and adrenaline so that it creates this diversion with which they can use to sort of extract this one prisoner that they want. So the technology got pretty fun to play with once it sort of got settled. So the first book is about sort of how that technology got created. The second book is how it sort of begins to get corrupted as different people try to use it, gain control of it. There's a terrorist group that tries to gain control of it. One of the interesting storylines there is that there's a scientist who works with the technology, whose daughter has a terminal genetic disease. So she uses it to try to cure her daughter with this type of gene therapy with it. But if she kind of overdoes it. And so she thinks that this program that she's put into her daughter to cure her has cured her, but then died off. But it actually is still, this AI system is still sort of living inside her, which creates some very interesting, juxtapositions. And I like that analogy too, because as I was looking at AI and how it's developing and things of like hallucinations and how it makes mistakes, it very much reminded me of, raising a child, and the mistakes they make and the sort of impulsiveness of their decision making. It felt very true to what the stuff I'm seeing with AI was.
And then that brings us to the third book, which is it out? Just released?
Yes, yes, it's actually been out almost a year,
Oh, okay.
and it's the Great Unmaking, and it's kind of the culmination, sort of when things get out of control. And it was fun because it's an apocalyptic book, so I got to kind of destroy the world, but I didn't want to make it like where the AI is evil. I didn't want to make it where the technology is consciously trying to, wipe out humans. It was much more a sense that each program, and there's like 4 or 5 now by this book that are out there, they're all doing technically what they've been designed to do. But when they sort of get mixed together or they try to compete with each other, it causes this sort of cataclysmic collapse. So
So, what drew you to this as your theme for this trilogy? Where did your idea come from?
yeah, yeah. So I think, being in grad school when I started this, I was definitely thinking very much along the sort of romantic, scientific romances is what they were called back then, of
Hmm.
like H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds, the Time Machine, where you're looking at making an exciting narrative with action and adventure, but you're also kind of, you know, trying to answer some questions or at least pose some interesting questions about where technology is going, what are the pitfalls, how do people get addicted to technology, how does it kind of grow out of control and have these unintended consequences. So that was kind of, they are a lot of fun. The books are very exciting, but I did have this sort of philosophical, background to it. I think particularly because I'd just been working in
Hmm.
IT and thinking about the evolution and where things were headed.
Did it sounds like something that would take a certain amount of research to write? Was there a lot of research involved?
There was quite a bit. And there are some really good books out there that sort of help me sort of imagine how technology would evolve. Like there's K. Eric Drexler's The
Mm.
Engines of Creation, which is a pretty famous book about nanotechnology. That one was very helpful. I also had to do quite a bit of research on the military because I hadn't been in the military. So I had quite a few characters that were, military scientists or they were the generals or admirals who were sort of running this program, similar to like a Manhattan Project kind of setup. And so I had to do quite a bit of research on that and interview people in the military to try to make sure that I was getting those stories right and those characters right.
This podcast has, for most of its existence, focused quite heavily on the creative process, and I like to still do that. So,
Yeah.
what was your planning process? Did you create a very detailed outline? Was it more sketchy and then you developed it as you went? How did that work for you?
Yeah, definitely with the first book, it was just mayhem. It just, it was just me trying to figure it out, and that's what they say, right? The only way to learn how to write a novel is to write a novel, right? And I was all over the place. I did so many drafts of that first book, changed things around so much. It was, I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but from the initial idea of that book till it was published was 18 years.
Well,
I did write the
That's a
other book.
Tolkien number.
Yeah, I did write the other book in there, the one about Venezuela, and that was in the process. But it took a lot of revision. It took a lot of, hard criticism. There There's one friend of mine who read it who gave me a really hard kind of feedback. He's like, right now you've got two books. This is trying to be both a mystery and it's trying to be a thriller. You have to pick one. And at that point, I had to basically erase half of the book and
Oh,
rewrite the second half again. So it was a lot of work and a lot of revision. Um, and you can feel that, I think, when you read it. Not that it reads smoothly, but what you feel is that there's quite a lot behind each of the characters, because in that period of time I'd gotten to know the characters quite well.
you had time to raise them from a child if it took
That's
18
right,
years.
exactly. They were full grown adults. That's right.
So once you've done that one, did the process change now for the next two? Now that you had that one under your belt?
Yeah, it also helps to have a deadline, right?
Yes,
So the second book took about 18 months, and then the third took only about 11. So
you're getting faster.
uh, you're getting faster. Of course, to do the second, when I was doing the second book, I was really helping map out the third, which definitely helped. So I knew most of the plot of the third book even before I'd finished the second.
So now, do you have more detailed outlines or
Yeah, I do. I don't write out outlines. I usually can do a lot of that, I feel, in my head. Um, I don't do a ton of meta writing. I'd say maybe only 5-10% of my writing time is where I sit down and I go, okay, what should happen next? I literally have conversations like this in my journal. I'm like, okay, this part of the book is working, but I don't like this part. How can we make this part better? I'll actually write that out as I go, as I fill up my journals. And that sort of internal dialogue, dialectic, really helps me sort out as I go what I should be doing. And I think it's a little bit like, I think when they talk about TV shows, like a TV series, like by the end of this season, certain things have to happen with the characters, but you're sort of free within each episode to sort of let it flow within that space. That's kind of the way I approach it.
that process is interesting to me because whenever I'm teaching writing, which I've, or at least guiding people in writing, haven't
Uh-huh.
done a lot of formal teaching, but I've done some. I often say that the process is one of asking yourself questions as you write. So, if this, then, and that
Yeah,
sort of thing.
yeah.
So, yeah, it is very much an internal back and forth, I think. And some people write it down, and some people it's just in their heads, and some people
Hmm.
do it as they write. So, it's always interesting to find out.
Yeah,
What's your
yeah.
physical schedule of writing? Do you do it every day, or do you have a set time, or is it more when you can find the chance to do
It,
it?
it's usually when I can find the chance. I've got two kids under 14 in the house, so that pushes things. So when they leave for the morning, that's great, and that usually gives me a little bit of time. Um, but yeah, it is kind of whenever I can get it. I One thing I do that I used to be very strict about, like word limits, making sure I hit certain goals. I kind of gave that up because made it a little bit too stressful. So now I just give myself time. So I say
Hmm.
within this time period, you have to be working on it. And that working on it, in quotations, could be reading, it could be revising, it could be, checking some sources. So I don't sort of force myself to be generating new content all the time. And I think that helps. Definitely helps my sense of pressure or tension, but I also think it helps things flow a little bit better too. Yeah.
You've already said that you have people look at the book, or at
Hmm.
least sections of it.
Yeah.
So, how does the revision process work? Do you do first you write it, then do you do some polishing yourself, and then you start showing it to other people, or how does that work for you?
Yeah, yeah. So as I mentioned, I don't think that many people still do this, but I write things out. So I have those like thick black art journals with no lines on them, and I just write everything in those. And then I'll transfer that to the computer, and usually I'll listen to music while I do that, so I'm kind of getting a flow, because I am sort of just copying it. But it also gets a pretty good edit at that point. It's
Hmm.
better than it was in the journal because I've typed it back in and thought about some things. So, and then I'll rework it maybe two or three more passes. I'll print it out I like to have it printed out, and I read it, and I just trust my edit as I just line edit it. And then when I think, okay, I don't know what else to do with this, that's the moment I'm like, okay, I need somebody else to look at it. And sometimes that'll just be a section. Like, I'm not sure this section of the book is working. So I'll give that usually to my wife. My unsuspecting wife has to read that. And I'll take her feedback and just kind of move forward in that kind of cadence.
And you'd mentioned maybe having military people look at things, or do you do that for some technical aspects of the book?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of the technical aspects I can usually find online or through other books. The military stuff I usually find I have to rely on contacting people to get information, especially if I'm building a character. Um, it does help that my wife is a scientist and has a
Oh,
PhD in biology, so that helps with some of the stuff. So I have a good in-house source that I don't have to pay for that.
my wife's an engineer, which is a very, very good thing for a freelance writer to marry.
That's right, right. Someone with a steady income, always
That's
good.
right, and a good pension plan. Yes,
That's right.
You were talking about working that way, where you write it out and then type it in. I used to work that way when I started
Uh-huh.
because my I was looking up here. I think I have the notebook up here, but I can't see it at the moment. First novels I wrote were in high school, and it was partly because we had a teacher who had us do a writing book. We had to write a page a day of something, and mine's all dated right up to I get to the end of the semester, and then it just keeps going because I was writing a novel and I didn't stop. But
Oh, great.
then
Yeah.
I went back in and I had learned to type in grade 10. I was immediately the fastest typist because I was motivated to type, and I rewrote everything, and I remember that process of editing it as I typed what I had handwritten. So
Yeah.
that does speak to me, as they say. But I don't work that way anymore because I absolutely detest the act of handwriting. So
Oh, really? Interesting.
I
Interesting.
have
Yeah.
I have terrible handwriting, and it's just, and these days it's so, I do it so little, I find I can barely sign my name. It feels like. So I don't know about your kids. My daughter, who's 22, almost
Hmm.
23. Uh, I guess she kind of learned to handwrite. She can sign her name, but it looks like it's being written by a 12-year-old
Yeah.
because she prints everything. But she
Yeah.
prints faster
Yeah.
and way more legible than my handwriting ever was. So I'm like, well, it seems like that's a skill that shouldn't be lost, but at the same time, I can read what she writes and I can't read stuff I wrote as a kid in my handwriting.
Right.
So I
Right.
don't know.
No, it's fascinating. Yes, my kids are the same way. They're 14 and 10, so same kind of thing. Um, what's interesting about that is I'm going to put in a plug here for a friend of mine. He studies logo design. He's a professor. He studies logo design. His name's James Bowie, and he studies how logos are having to change. Logos that used to be in cursive are now being
Mm.
phased out. Like Eddie Bauer, Campbell Soup, all these things that used to be in cursive, the companies are finding they have to drop the cursive because the new generation can't actually read what it says.
Oh dear. I mean,
And the
I
big
don't think
question is whether Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola, are they going to change their logo because it's technically in cursive?
that also means that there are hundreds of years of things that have been written that people may have trouble reading
Exactly.
in the future.
Yeah.
So it's kind of concerning. Going back to the book, though, and design, we were talking before we started about the cover art, which for the current one, which certainly intrigues me because I immediately said that looks like a paperback thriller from the 70s, and you said that's exactly what you were going for.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Do you
what
have it
was
there?
interesting? Yeah, I think I have a copy right here.
I have a printout of it here, but
Yeah. So people can kind of see what we're talking about. Um,
it
so
also looks like a movie poster of a certain era, I
right,
think.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. And so what's interesting is that the publishers actually, you know this, I'm sure. They actually recommend you stay away from portraits. That you stay away from faces because the idea is that the character in the book is sort of an avatar for which the reader sort of inserts themselves. So that's why you see so many, silhouettes of someone running down the street from the
Or from,
back,
you see, yeah, exactly.
the outline or something, right? So that
It's like the Robert J. Sawyer's new book that I just published.
yeah, yeah,
There's the characters,
exactly.
but you don't see them.
Right, right. And that sort of, and I understand that, and I think that makes good sense. But as we got to this last book in the series, and we had a pretty big ensemble cast of characters, and we had this idea of an apocalypse, we wanted to sort of represent that in the cover, but also give this the depth of the whole storyline and give it this kind of epic feel. So that's why we decided to go with the actual portraits of the characters. And just like you said, we were trying to go for this kind of throwback feel of both a movie poster and books from like the 60s and 70s, kind of pulp fiction. And the artist who worked on this is a fantastic artist who actually used to work for Disney and doing some production art. And he really got into it. I mean, he read the whole book. We talked many times. It took him about 6 weeks of work, and he explained to me. He said this is 1,000 Photoshop layers in
Wow.
there. 1,000. And the detail is crazy. In fact, there's a scene in Africa where there's like a compound at the edge of the desert, and there's a firefight and an explosion, and there's even like a container from a container ship, so it says Maersk Sealand on the side. And he actually, if you look close enough, you almost need like a magnifying glass to see it, but if you look closely enough on the cover, you can see this little container that says Maersk Sealand on it. So great attention to detail, and I thought it did a really nice job of capturing the sort of epic feel that I wanted to get for the book.
So the trilogy is complete. Have you been pleased with the response?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. What's interesting is that it was done by Blackstone Publishing, which is a relatively small publisher. And out of the gate, the first book did not make much of a splash. And as I mentioned, it's about this arms race between the United States and China. It's about sort of creating technology that can sort of enter a person's body and manipulate them or kill them. But it didn't really get much press coming out of the gate. Then COVID happened, and suddenly a book that was dealing with China and the possibility of a synthetic virus became very interesting, I guess. So that kind of launched the
I'd
book.
say you were lucky, but I don't think that's quite the right word for that.
Right. It's just kind of circumstance, right? And that's what's interesting because, it absolutely took off in a big way. And it also took off as an audiobook. Much more than anything. Like the sales of the audiobook, I would say, are almost like 10 times that of the paperback and the hardcover, which are still pretty good. So the book had this external thing happen to it that helped, make it a hit. The second book was also a success, and it got its boost just by Amazon. Someone at Amazon liked the cover art of the second book, so they put it on their sort of upcoming books for the spring, and so that helped get a lot of good numbers out of the gate for that book. Um, Nothing like that happened for the third book, or has happened yet. So its sales are actually a little bit less, even though, in my opinion, it's a book that is a lot more exciting and a little bit more, definitely more intense and easier to read, I think, than the second one. So it's just, as you know, with publishing, there's a lot of things. There's things you can control, and then there's things that are just kind of
Yes.
outside of your control. You can do your best to write the best book you can, but when it goes out there, you are sort of at the whim of the market.
And I
Um,
think it's generally a thing that with trilogies and series in general, the first book often is the biggest one, and then
mhm.
you hope you can hold on to that, but you don't
Yeah,
necessarily get everybody that bought the first one going on to read the others. So you do
right,
see
right.
a diminishing. Certainly, certainly it happened in a trilogy that I wrote. We saw
Yeah.
things like that. So, and what are you working on now?
So I thought you'd find this interesting. So I've gone into high fantasy.
No,
I'm
well, you
working
said
on
trying to get that
yeah, yeah.
Tolkien thing going.
That's right. That was part of the inspiration. So I am doing like a high fantasy. It's very interesting to do. I have never tried to build an elaborate world before. So, doing the naming of things, trying to make something feel fresh. It's an interesting push and pull because, as you know, it's such a well-known genre that your reader is coming to the table with a lot of preconceived notions about
Hmm.
what the world could be, right? So if you say, the wizard walked down the street, your reader probably already has something very concrete in their mind, even though your wizard might not have a beard and a pointy hat, or a cane, right? So it is kind of interesting to sort of play with what the reader might assume and then sort of add in it and try to make it fresh. That is a challenge, of course, when you're doing a genre that's kind of so well known.
How far along are you?
So I'm just about 40,000 words into it, which I think will be about a third. Yeah. I've got I know where it's going to go. I know the ending. Um, but it's been kind of fun to nerd out on sort of the Tolkien-esque things, like, what's the word root for this, and how if you combine these two, if I've combined this Finnish root with this Welsh root of this word, what new word can I come up with that sounds like it's from this society versus this other society that might be influenced by like Old Norse or Anglo-Saxon, right? It is fun to sort of play around with the language there. And obviously, I'm not nearly the linguist that Tolkien was, but it is kind of fun.
I actually wrote a biography of Tolkien for a children's publisher and
Oh
educational
wow.
publisher, a very short one,
Uh-huh.
and obviously drawing on the like Humphrey Carter and the more familiar.
Yeah.
But it was very interesting to me to write about him and to find out more about him than I superficially knew. So
Yeah. Yeah. A little fun fact I came across just the other day. I don't know if you watched The Lord of the Rings and the sort of the extended versions, right? They
hmm
have all the sort of background about Tolkien, and I think it's one of in the Fellowship of the Ring. They talk about how um, you know Tolkien really hated any sense of allegory. He hated any sense of people comparing Mordor to Germany in the World War II. He detested those sort of one-to-one connections, and Tolkien was way above that, right? But I was watching an old interview with Tolkien, and someone was asking him about the different races, and he's like, "Oh yeah, the dwarves are Jewish. Yeah, they're just Jewish people." And he just like said it right out, and I just thought it was so interesting that people in revising or looking at him are always like, "Oh, well, he was above this," or he would never think to do something stereotypical. But he's like, "No, the dwarves are Jewish." Yeah,
yeah, it's like Mark Twain famously said Huckleberry Finn, where he says that people trying to find a moral should be shot or something like that
yeah,
in the
yeah,
intro.
yeah.
But that stuff is always in what we write. It's in some fashion
Hmm.
because all we have is what's in our head and what's going on around us in the world. And so
Right,
I
right.
think I think we're all in some fashion writing, maybe not allegory, but it certainly is reflecting how we see the world.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree.
Where can people find you online?
So I have a website. Yeah, it's briannelsonbooks.com. And then I'm pretty active on Facebook. So people can find me there under Brian Nelson Author. And yeah, I'm posting quite a bit. I'm hopefully going to throw up some of my excerpts from the fantasy soon to see if they sort of get people's attention and do a little beta testing. But yeah, that's where I am, and it's been going well.
Do you have any timeline on this book and when we might see it?
I don't, and I actually haven't even told my agent about it yet.
Oh,
So
shh.
I think it'll probably be probably about a year till I think I'll be done with it. And I guess the reason I didn't tell my agent is I was like, well, I'm going to write this book anyway. It was one of those things you're like, maybe she might say the market would prefer you write this kind of book, but I was kind of like, well, if I tell her, then she might steer me away from doing what I want to do. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and do it.
If she watches this podcast, she will know.
I know. I know. I hopefully she'll forgive me.
Well, thanks so much, Brian. I enjoyed the chat. I hope you did as well.
Absolutely, Ed. It was great being here. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. And thanks again to Brian for that conversation. That was fun. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. That brings us to the end of this episode of the Worldshapers. I will, of course, go through the usual housekeeping steps to begin with, letting you know that the Worldshapers has its own website, theworldshapers.com, where you can find all past episodes and more information about each of the authors' social media links and all that sort of thing. Book covers, lots of good stuff. You can also find the Worldshapers on X/Twitter at the Worldshapers. You can find it on Facebook at the Worldshapers. You can find me personally at edwardwillett.com. You can find me on X at ewillett, on Facebook at edward.willett, on Instagram at edwardwillettauthor, and did I miss anything? YouTube at Edward Willett. You're probably there right now if you're watching this, but if you're just listening, you might not be. And if you go to my YouTube channel and hopefully subscribe, you can also walk with me around my home city of Regina in my Walking in Regina series. And I don't do it quite every day, although I did when I first started. But several times a week I'll be out for at least a short walk around my home city of Regina, Saskatchewan. And I talk about publishing and writing and stuff like that as I do that. So you might want to check that out. I mentioned my publishing company off the start. That's Shadowpaw Press. Shadowpawpress.com is the website. It's on Twitter at Shadowpaw Press, on Instagram at Shadowpaw Press, and on Facebook at Shadowpaw Press. Very easy, that one. That brings us to the conclusion of this episode of The Worldshapers. I hope you'll come back next week as I talk to another great author about another great book, and continue to come back in the future as I continue to do so going forward. That's it for this episode. Bye for now.
Thank you.